Nic Marks, the CEO and founder of Friday Pulse, and this is Molly, who is the, I guess, CEO and founder of Flexa. Yes.
Yes, CEO and one of three co-founders of
Yeah.
Flexa. Yeah,
And so today we're going to talk in this webinar about flexibility at work, about finding the right balance around flexibility at work, and that tricky thing. But first of all, before I get Molly to introduce herself, if you want to write in the chat about how many days do you work in the office or at home or whatever way around it is, and about flexibility in your role, so that we can think about what's going on. I know we asked in a poll in the run up to this webinar that what people prefer, and people tend to prefer hybrid or fully remote. We didn't have many people saying they wanted to be fully in the office at the moment, so that's an interesting thing to find out. So I can already see one person saying 2 to 3 days in the office, the rest at home. Raj, nice to meet you. So do pop in there what you're doing. So while we're doing that, Molly, perhaps you would like to introduce yourself about your background and who you are and why you founded Flexa.
absolutely. Pleasure to be here. So thank you for inviting me. So I'm Molly. I am the CEO and, as I mentioned, kind of one of three co-founders of Flexa. Flexa is where every flexible company gets discovered. So we've built a platform currently with 1.6 million people using it,
Wow.
searching for exactly how they want to work and finding companies that match their filter preferences. So someone could say, I want to work in the office 3 days a week, but I want it to be dog friendly so I can bring my dog when I do go in, and I'd love some flexible hours so I can, leave a bit earlier to pick my children up and then start work later on at home. Everyone's idea of flexibility is varied, wonderfully varied, and there are obviously so many companies with different ideas of flexibility that we thought it made total sense to bring transparency to the hiring process and enable people to filter down those companies based on their preferences. We work with around 200 different companies that use Flexa to build an employer brand centered on their EVP and flexibility, reaping pretty amazing results in terms of visibility and being known as an employer of choice globally as well. My background, and I guess like the reason for us starting it. So I actually started my career in investment banking, which is very much not aligned to what I do now. I'm very inflexible. And when I left university, I found out that I actually had a quite severe autoimmune disease that meant that sometimes I couldn't walk, like my feet would swell up, my hands would swell up. So obviously investment banking wasn't really the best place for me. I kind of struggled through about 18 months of working there, and eventually they came to me and they said, well, you can make a request to work from home 1 day a week. I thought, great, that would really help me. I can work from home 1 day when I'm really sick. And 10 days later, they put a settlement package in front of me, sacked me, and told me to leave immediately. And I then went into that job hunting process that is totally opaque, with no understanding of where was going to let me work from home 1 day a week and where it wouldn't damage how I was judged and my performance. That was impossible. Eventually ended up at a flexible company, asked them why they weren't shouting about it. They said there was nowhere to shout about it. And Flexa was born 2 weeks before the pandemic.
It's brilliant timing. Yeah.
Yeah.
So they literally just sort of showed you the door for asking for a day working from home, even though
Yeah.
they suggested it.
Yeah, it was an incredibly, well, they suggested it so that they could send me to an occupational health therapist and then get rid of me on the basis that I did have something wrong with me. They just had to prove it, sadly. But yes, it was a totally inflexible culture, and having one person who worked flexibly, I think, would have thrown that culture into question as to why people had to be in the office for, on average, about 16 hours a day, 5 days a week.
Yeah. Yeah, I often find out quite a lot of people, talk about a 4-day week, and we can talk about that if we want to, but I think sometimes just a 5-day week of sensible hours would be great instead
Yeah,
for quite a lot of people, wouldn't it?
exactly. Just a sensible 5 day week, I think, is an improvement. Like we do a 4.5 day week because there's so much evidence to suggest that past 2:39 on a Friday, people are just inherently very unproductive. People are off doing their washing, they might have gone to the pub. Um, it's been a long week by that point, and people want to extend their weekends. So we decided to just offer it off, getting rid of unproductive time, but obviously packaging it up as a benefit that improves engagement and happiness.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So you launched Flexa 2 weeks before COVID struck. That's superb timing. It must have been an anxious time for you the first few months, but I imagine that's worked in your favor as an organization since, yeah.
Very much so. If we look back to kind of pre-pandemic levels of flexibility, it was very much seen as something that people had to justify needing. And it wasn't necessarily something that you could say, well, I just work better in the evening, so I want flexible hours, or I don't feel like commuting every single day, so I want to work from home 2 days a week. It was based around need and justification. And around 30% of the UK, and this is UK when I talk about it, we are global, but most of our data that we reference comes from when we first started, around this period of time. Around 30% of people said that flexible working was a non-negotiable when choosing their next employer. Fast forward to now, and 80% of the global office population say that it's a non-negotiable. So for us, the demand has more than doubled. And also the supply of it as well. So more and more companies are pushing the boundaries on what the future of work looks like for them. It used to be that work was done in a certain place 5 days a week with pretty set hours. Now it's a spectrum. There's weird and wonderful ways that people are pushing those boundaries of the balance of flexibility, and being able to represent those companies and make them searchable is much more exciting when there's variety like that.
Absolutely. And you talk about there being lots of different types of flexibility. So and it's not all about just where you work from. What other types of flexibility do you see employers offering or employees wanting?
So where you work, obviously, we've talked about that, kind of anything from fully remote through to 4 days a week in the office, 1 day a week from home. Weird and wonderful ways of doing hours. So like totally asynchronous. There are never like synced up meetings. You kind of catch up through Loom and Slack, all the way through to, a bit of flexibility to drop your kids off. The 4 day week, or what I call the evolved work week, obviously comes in lots of different formats. You've got companies doing 4.5 day weeks, 9 day fortnights, 4 day weeks, like all sorts of mixtures of things. Holiday is a great one to have flexibility, whether you've got company shutdown weeks between Christmas and New Year, or we do one at the end of August as well, adding additional holiday minimums on unlimited, all sorts of ways of packaging that up. And then the benefit side of things too, whether you're trying to be like a family-friendly employer in terms of enhanced parental leaves, you really want to encourage people to spend time with their pets, we've seen like paternity leave come in, other benefits like Airbnb allowances, so you can travel and work. There's so many different ways you can kind of add flexibility and fun into your EVP. And we're seeing all sorts of companies come up with really weird and wonderful things.
So it probably used to be that the job market, it felt like all the power was held by employers.
Yeah.
There seems to be a huge switch going on, doesn't there? I mean, I was reading some data from Boston Consultancy Group relatively recently, saying that 3/4 of people get approached, by employers to apply for jobs. So people feel quite powerful, or perhaps more powerful than I think I felt when I was young. You felt like you were going cup in hand for a job really to begin with. But I wonder what you felt about that, whether you felt that really was shifting that power between the employer and the employee.
I think it's been an interesting shift, because the power between employer and employee has probably flip-flopped at least 3 times, even since we've started. I think it's quite rapid. So obviously when COVID hit, furloughing happened, lots of redundancies. There was a realization that employees wanted more, but also there was a kind of attitude of like, well, how fussy can people be? Because it's in a time of need. And then as we were kind of coming out of that and more into that, defining that future of work, the best talent started to be able to demand more. And there really was a difference in the balance of power. Like the top talent could say, I don't want to go into the office 5 days a week. I want to be paid more. And especially as we move into the era of like much more personal branding, personal networks, like employees are valuable in and of themselves, not just because they are a resource that can perform a role. Like that individual person is more valuable. So I think there's lots of different contributing forces as to why there has been a bit of a shift of power. And I think there was a real power imbalance of like the employers were really struggling to hire top talent. And that's coming back a little bit because, again, we're in a downturn, there have been redundancies, but that top talent still is demanding more, and people won't settle for companies that aren't offering flexibility and at least market rate competitive pay.
Yeah. I mean, in that same Boston Consultancy report, I think, Angie, you got the link for it if you want to put it in the chat. They were talking about how what most people want from a job is stability and good work-life balance. Those are the two biggest things that people are looking for.
Mm.
Then obviously comes pay, and then it varies by age quite a lot. The young want to learn more. Holidays allowance becomes more important, and then just whether you get along with people tends to come and kick into it as you get older as well. But yeah, it seems people have actually got, the majority of people, and that's not necessarily where the top talent market is, they just want a job that treats them fairly, treats them as adults. We can make decisions. And so I think it's a really exciting shift that's going on, because clearly it's been very paternalistic business or hierarchical, and it seems to be shifting quite a lot towards this, respecting people as humans, respecting the experience they have outside of work as well. We're not just work slaves. So yeah, it's very, very exciting. I mean, I must admit, I think Flexa is very, very exciting as an offer, really, because I can see how it makes total sense that you can go to one job site where everybody on it as offering some flexibility. So that's probably 1.2 million people or whatever it was on there.
Yeah, I think there's a really, it depends on which, loads of studies have been done, as you mentioned, that kind of BCG one, around what people value. And as you said, like, it does really vary generationally. There are others that have looked at, like, assuming pay is fair, so assuming salary doesn't come into it, what are the biggest driving factors, and depending on generation. But if we focus on Gen Z and millennial, it's flexibility, then mission. Is that company kind of mission driven, social or environmental impact, and then interestingly, kind of personal and professional development comes in as well, so that L&D side. And I think because there are so many different factors around what makes an employer attractive, it's a really exciting time for employers to kind of pick their EVP and employer brand niche and really gain a competitive advantage, depending on the type of talent that they want to hire. If you are the kind of company that's super keen on L&D and you're going to put lots into your budgets around that, you want to hire people that really value that. So being transparent, weaving that into your EVP, shouting about it, you're going to hire like-minded people. Same with if you are super flexible. Like, so much of our employer brand is based on flexibility because we're super flexible. We want people who are passionate about that and value that. So we shout about that and have a huge competitive advantage as a result. And companies have never really had that before. You had to hinge on, like, we're either really well known, or we pay really well, or our office is really cool, you get free beer on a Friday. Like, there were limited amounts of exciting things that you could use to get that competitive advantage. Whereas now the world is kind of your oyster. And if you look at the way Patagonia, for example, were like way ahead of their curve. They use social and environmental good as their big employer brand and treated their employees brilliantly. They will never have to spend a penny on recruitment ever, because of how much of a competitive advantage they forged for people who align with their values and align with their purpose. And we've never seen a time like that before. So for companies to get ahead, I think, get creative and start thinking about what matters to you as a company with your EVP. And that's why Flexa exists as well, to help bring that attention, because it's really bloody hard to stand out when you are just posting a job description on the 77th job platform that somebody might actually look at. I think we've got so much opportunity now to really forge interesting pre-application relationships with the type of talent that you want to foster in the future.
Yeah. I mean, I was so I'm just seeing this thing. So could you help us understand one? If you work more than 183 days, can you work for another country? Oh, that's a very specific question. I don't know if you've got an answer to that.
I do actually know the answer to that, but I always have to caveat, like, I'm not a lawyer, nor am I a tax advisor, and it's very, very complicated and nuanced. If you work more than 183 days from the UK, if you are a UK citizen, you can go and work in other countries and remain a UK taxpayer, but it depends on the tax laws of the country that you go and work from. So you can fall into very difficult pitfalls. Like in Switzerland, as far as I'm aware, you can't work there more than 45 days without your company and you having to pay tax there. So you need to look at the incoming tax legislation in those countries before you go and actually stay there.
Great. I mean, I guess there are all these sort of blocks to flexibility in some ways. Yeah. So, I mean, going back to this sort of balancing act around remote and in person, where are you finding any particularly interesting, creative new ways that people are approaching that. Yes, we've talked about 4-day weeks and whatever like that, but I'm just wondering if there's, I don't know, something that surprised you that's coming through from the employer side.
Not necessarily surprised. I feel like we've seen so many different ways. I don't know what could surprise me anymore. I feel like maybe choosing to go into the office 5 days a week and having no flexibility on that would surprise me the most. Some really creative ways of doing hybrid that I've started, like obviously this whole webinar is based on the idea of like in-person and remote balance, and I think the evolution of that is fascinating. So lots of companies, and like the majority at the moment of companies, are choosing 3 days a week in the office, hybrid. And I've seen companies start to say, in the month, we want you in the office like 20% of the time. So you could then choose to do that in a big block or space that out. Obviously, depending on your situation, you can kind of flex that and vary it. And I think that's a very creative way of encouraging that in-person time, but it being much more flexible than like, you need to be in the office 1 day a week or 2 days a week. It's kind of giving people a bit more choice and a bit more option, especially like, say, for example, if you lived outside of London and your company was based in London, you might come to London for a week, work from the office for that time, and then go back home again for 3 weeks. So I think that percentage split rather than mandating days is very interesting. The same as remote first, having that choice of an office, but then people can come in and out as much as they want to, and encouraging those in-person connections is also a very interesting way of doing that.
Yeah, there's a coordination thing between that, isn't it? It's because obviously for teams that, you sort of want people to be in the office at the same time so that they can actually mix. And so there definitely becomes a tension between those two needs, doesn't there?
Definitely. And I think it's a conundrum that a lot of companies are kind of facing at the moment, is probably what's a manager who's used to traditional ways of working believes is the minimum amount of in-person time is probably very different to what somebody believes is the minimum amount of in-person time to be able to do their job. And so I think every company, when embarking on understanding exactly what that right balance is, needs to look at it from like, what tasks are valuable being done in person, like sitting on a Zoom call for a day, for sitting on a selection of Zoom calls to clients for a day is probably better done at home. And if you force people into the office to do that, they're going to start to resent that in-person time. Whereas forging in-person connections with strategy days, team days, lunches, team building activities, in-person meetings where everyone is present, and encouraging that on a less frequent basis, or mandating it on a less frequent basis, will probably actually have the opposite effect of what you think it will have, and encourage people to come in more often because they start to value that time. Whereas forcing people in more often will probably have the opposite effect, and it'll make them want to come in less.
Yeah. Yeah, we're contrary creatures, aren't we, sometimes?
Yeah. I don't like being told what to do. People love choice. And it's better to communicate the minimum expectations and let people have choice around that than it is to be ambiguous and kind of leave it up to the individual and say, but we'd kind of appreciate it if you came into the office 2 days a week. Like, be clear, we want you in at least once a week, or we want you in at least 20% of the time, or whatever it might be.
Yeah. So I've seen data about home working, remote working in the UK compared to the rest of Europe. And it seems to me that the data I've seen shows that Britain is an outlier, and that we've actually still got many more days working from home than the rest of Europe. And I've heard this critiqued in The Economist and other places like that we're all lazy, that we're inflexible, we don't want to come back, we're avoiding work, and it's all to do with Britain's productivity crisis, that, this is a symptom of it. And I wondered how you answer people when they ask you those sort of questions. Is Britain are we just actually just showing that we're lazy, that we want to do this, or are we actually embracing and leading on something new and rather brilliant?
I think it's a combination of two things. I think we have a little bit of a broken relationship with work. I think particularly millennials and Gen Y, because we worked and worked and worked and worked and didn't necessarily get that much reward from it. Yeah. The reality of just being able to work hard until you're 30 and then you can buy a lovely house and that's all fine. Like, that doesn't exist anymore, does it?
No.
And I think we gave so much and it encroached so significantly on our work-life balance that COVID was almost like a bit of a reset and a readjustment of, this actually isn't sustainable. Yeah. And how can we make it work for us? So I think there's that side, which is attention And hence why I think there's so much resistance of going back to what it was like, because nobody wants to return to that. And it was a very unsustainable and very unbalanced system before. And then on the flip side of things, I think companies are also realizing that there is a huge opportunity here to hire the best talent, the most diverse talent possible. And some companies have really lent into it and kind of set that bar quite high. I think the fact that the UK is leading on it is very interesting. And I do think it's probably more the former than the latter that is driving that. It's just there is an opportunity now. But the UK also has a significantly higher supply of flexible working as well, because companies know that they kind of have to lean into it as well. What I do find interesting with people, when media and naysayers will try and say, oh, well, flexible working is less productive, some of the biggest studies ever have pointed to the fact that hybrid working, so that's anything, when we say hybrid, that's some regular time in office, so that could be anything from remote first through to actually, like 3 days a week hybrid, is just as productive as going into the office 5 days a week. But individuals are happier, more engaged, retention is better, cost to hire is lower. So ultimately, it's win-win, offering that level of flexibility. And then it's shown that remote has slightly lower productivity, but the cost savings in it are so enormous that it kind of depends on what you're looking for as a company in terms of your priorities. So I always find the argument of like, oh, flexibility is less productive. And I think maybe because there's been such demand for it and such a push, that we've had to provide a supply of flexible working, that we've been able to realize the benefits quicker. And I think actually the people that shout loudest are the ones that have a stake in people coming back to offices because they own an enormous amount of property, or businesses that depend on people being in offices. And we do have a government and a top tier of society that are heavily invested in that. And it's kind of, you can't kind of unpick any bit as to which one, who's shouting loudest and why that's happening, I think.
So one thing that I wonder, and I don't know, you might know this, but it's occurred to me, is the commute is more difficult in the UK than many other European countries. We're very London centric. People, I'm pretty sure, tend to have a longer commute to work in the UK than lots of other places. We're very densely populated, so that makes it pleasant. I mean, I know from data on happiness, which is obviously my specialty, shows that the least happy activity of the day is the commute to work.
Yeah.
The second least happy is the commute from work, and the third is work itself. But I wonder whether the commute plays into it, because clearly we've also got a slightly creaking public transport system, and so I wonder whether you felt that was one of the factors that was driving more flexibility in the UK.
I think that's a really interesting point. And I think it probably is, in terms of the sacrifice that we've made. It just started not making sense anymore to commute for an hour to get into a job that you'll then be there for 10 hours and break yourself to then not get very much reward, and all of that can be kind of done from home. So there probably are loads of different factors like that one. But yeah, the commute's a really interesting one.
Yeah. Yeah, we're very densely populated. Yeah, I think it's a problem. We're very London centric, obviously, still with the work, or than many other places. I'm just looking to the right here, to the questions. So Philippe, how to deal with flexibility that goes in the direction of actually working sometimes much extra work, extra hours, and sometimes much less than expected. So I haven't quite got that question. Have you got that one? Can you see it written?
Yeah. I'm not 100% sure on.
You might just need to clarify that, Philippe, the question. Yeah, thank you. So how do you suggest a company maintains its culture and values with less face-to-face time? From Michael.
It should be just as easy. It shouldn't make a difference if you're remote first and still maintaining that in-person time. It's adaptation and making sure that you are. So there's a few kind of pointers and hints and tips that I would say to companies about kind of maintaining that remote first culture. So one is making sure that you're remote by kind of default, and that if you are doing kind of hybrid meetings, you're always making sure that people can dial into that easily, and the sound quality is good, and that you're not actually interrupting the experience with bad tech is really fundamental. Another one is like, if you have got people in office, making sure that people that are working remotely feel included. So like, we have a rule where if there's a joke or like something funny happens in the office, we have to tell everybody in Slack about what's happened. So then, when you do end up meeting up, there's not one side that go into the office. I go into the office 3 days a week. We have a lot of people who do as well, but people only have to come in once a month. So making sure that there isn't that divide, and ensuring that you have got that once a month or that in-person time that works for you. Like some companies will say it's 2 days a month in the office, and that will be focused purely on activities that really help build their culture and reinforce those values. So strategy, big company explanations, brainstorming, team building activities. And it might feel like that is an unproductive day, but actually, because of bringing people together to gel, to understand each other, to bond, it actually helps with productivity then working remotely, because you understand each other much better and have a better working relationship. I'm a huge fan of in-person time, but I don't think it has to be enormously frequent for it to be valuable. So I think actually a lot of the companies that point to the fact that going remote kind of ruined their culture, that's probably an internal problem rather than a remote problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to be much more intentional about it.
Yes.
So we will do things like, randomly assign people to have a 15-minute coffee break, which has got nothing to do with work. You're not supposed to talk about work on it. We have a once a week stand up for the whole team, where we talk about what's gone well last week, what hasn't, and we use obviously our own tool, Friday Pulse, to do that. But I think just had to be much more intentional about it. And one of the I think one of the issues that, so in the 1980s, 1990s, they started to experiment with what they call telecommuting, which is basically people working from home. It's the first time that you could have a keyboard at home, you could do data entry, you could do some other things in it. And what happened to those people is that they missed out on the whole career path that people that came into the office. So one of the dangers of working remotely is that you get forgotten about, isn't it? And so that's why I think intention is so important. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, I think that word intentional is a very good one. I spend a lot of my time, both subconsciously and consciously, thinking about how I can foster the best culture in a remote first way, because it gets the most out of people. And people are very happy at Flexa. We've never had one voluntary leaver in 3.5 years, which is pretty amazing. But it does take time, and you have to think about it. And if there's been somebody who seems quiet, like, you have to bother to work out why. But in many ways, like, I think that's why that kind of hybrid or remote first culture can work very well, because people get forgotten about in offices all the time as well. And actually offices aren't very intentional, they're just very obvious. So I think actually and an office culture is not necessarily better, it's just easier.
It happens unconsciously in some ways, or randomly, and people pick up on what the things are. So you have to be more intentional about it. Actually, intentional is quite interesting. So Belinda, going back to a question you asked there, you said, interesting enough, what's been noticed, the commute to and from work helps prepare and wind down from your daily work. So there is this whole thing about personas. I mean, there's been this whole thing about bringing your whole self to work. Is that an appropriate thing? Is it not? Bring your best self. And I certainly was speaking to leaders during COVID, and I remember one guy saying to me, he said, he just come out of his home office, probably his bedroom, and his daughter, who's about 6, was there, and she looked up at him and she didn't recognize him because he was in work mode. He was probably a bit stressed. He was probably a bit, whatever. And where was Fun Daddy? Fun Daddy wasn't here in the kitchen. Suddenly there was this other man, and he said he really noticed that the commute to and from work allowed him to change personas. I mean, not change whole personalities, but just put on part of it. And I think that is an interesting thing about how, I certainly felt this the first lockdown was like, if you didn't realize where you began and where you ended, some of you. So that's been a learning curve, certainly, hasn't it? How do you, I still have it now. I mainly work from home and, go in the kitchen and suddenly have a chat to my wife, and you're always flipping between modes, which is straight away, which is sort of kind of interesting.
Yeah. And I think what more remote working has kind of forced us to do as individuals is to understand ourselves a bit better as well. Like, if it is the case that you really value the commute because of that preparation before and after, does that mean you want to go into the office more regularly, or do you need to emulate a commute in some way, like going for a walk with a coffee for 40 minutes in the morning before you start work, and then exactly the same in the evening? And I think what remote work, as well as it being intentional on the employer side, it also needs to be intentional from the employee side, understanding what works best for you, because you're not just forced into this certain pattern. And hence why we decided on like a very choice-based model, but with, quite strict output criteria of what performance are,
Yeah.
what performance is.
Yeah.
And what that's meant is like different people come into the office at different times, they work different hours, they have different habits that they probably didn't know would work for them when they were working in an office 5 days a week. So that word intentional, I think, rings true on the flip side of it as well. And understanding what you need to do as an employee to get your best work done.
Yeah.
And I don't think that just because a company goes remote that you can't get those, things like the commute and the benefits of that, or changing personas. Does that mean you need to take a very separate office somewhere else in your house or go to a co-working space? There are lots of ways around it.
Yeah.
And the possibilities of a flexible model are much more exciting than kind of the limitations of an office. But if you loved bits of the office, then you can bring them into that flexible model too.
Yeah. So one other thing to watch out for, I think I've seen in the data, is there are some sectors which have got much more fully remote, and I'm particularly thinking about the tech sector here. And I don't know whether you see that in your data, whether you see more fully remote jobs in tech and things like that. And mental health. And in the sense that actually people can get quite isolated just working from home. And I wonder whether you had thoughts on that, because I do think that is actually a real danger, particularly for certain personality types that are possibly drawn to that type of work. But actually they cannot see another human much, and that's really, really bad. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it comes back to that kind of knowing yourself part as well.
Yeah.
I think actually a lot of people don't maybe know their professional selves and what's best for them as much as they might think they do. And they might think that fully remote is best for them and that's what they really, really want. But actually it has some negative impacts. Hence why I do think that, so if you are a fully remote company, then having maybe quarterly meetups that facilitate those interactions, that then means that that remote employee realizes that somebody is 20 minutes down the road and they could meet at a co-working space once a month and have those in-person connections and foster them. I think loneliness and remote work is definitely an issue, and hence why I don't think that totally remote, like no contact ever, really works.
Yeah.
And I don't actually know any fully remote companies that don't do meetups at least quarterly because of that.
Yeah.
I do think it's very important. And I think, again, it comes back to like, you don't always know what's best for you. And quite often, like some of our employees are like, oh, I really love working remotely. And they then come in on that team day and it's a bit like, oh God, I've got to go all the way to London. And then at the end of it, they're like, oh, I had a great time. We should do this more often. And you're like, that they'll be worrying about that for ages and go, maybe I should just go to a fully remote company. But then actually at the end of it, they're like, no, this is good. I feel like I know my co-workers well and I've had those benefits. So that's why I think having guide rails and like a framework around what flexibility really is really important, and pushing people to potentially go out of their comfort zones at work to keep themselves happy.
Yeah. I'm glancing at this message from Rebecca saying, I'm struggling to get some staff members to see the value of spending any time together. We mostly work remote. There's a lot of words here, and I'm trying to hold the space too, but planning a small team, how to rely on it. Couples simply don't want to come in, will argue tooth and nail, even against just once a month. I mean, I think this is this is the difficult thing. I think there's a lot of power with employees at the moment, and actually there are some needs from the employer's side together, and that negotiation is difficult, isn't it? And
especially if you started with something different and then you're moving to a different model. I guess there's lots of kind of different bits there. It's like, how often do you want people to meet up? Maybe they feel like that's too often, or is it literally even meeting once a month is too much? In which case, like, the only things that I've seen work from people going fully remote into remote first is that focus on, it's not like we're coming together to work, like us as a company. So when we want people to come in once a month, we do go above and beyond to make sure that's very much a thing that people want to do. We pay for travel, we pay for a night's accommodation, we pay for dinner, we pay for that team building activity, and we make it a real thing so that once a month is super exciting and people then do want to come in more often. I don't think when everything works remotely, it needs to be a real reason, a real step change, because clearly it does in your company. Otherwise, you wouldn't be choosing remote. But when it's that real step change, people are like, but why? And if it's like, oh, well, basically once a month we're having a small party, that's a bit more exciting, and does build those in-person connections and encourages people to come in more. It is when you've started with one model and you're moving to another, if it's something that really, really matters and you do want to push that shift, I think people get very afraid of attrition and people leaving, but that is naturally going to happen because different people want to work in different ways. And if you want to go from fully remote to remote first, people are going to want to go and work in a remote way. Like it's a completely different job at the end of the day. And being some people leaving is unavoidable when that happens, but you also can't, sounds like you really want to move to that model and you can't say to some people, I know you don't need to come and everybody else does. So it's about kind of encouraging it as much as possible, but also accepting that there probably will be attrition as a result of it if it's a model you really want to move to because they've been working remotely for however long.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if you saw the Grindr stuff that happened last week. Did you see that? Yeah. So for people who didn't know, Grindr decided they wanted to have people in 2 days a week, and I think nearly half the company left, didn't they, about that? Yep. And it could see both sides to that, really. I mean, I don't know what their contracts were. I don't know whether did they start off as a remote first employment people, or was it's just left over from COVID? You know, or perhaps you don't know.
I'm not sure whether they started. I know they were for like pretty much the duration of COVID and afterwards. So it was like a lot of like, given that the average tenure now is under 3 years, like the majority of people will have joined when they were remote and kind of gone through. I think switching so significantly from remote to 2 days a week hybrid is a very, very big move. And I think when companies are deciding on that flexibility model, you do need to consult employees. And if you are choosing a model that the majority of people didn't vote for, it's kind of not surprising that half people are going to leave.
Yeah. I mean, it might be there's another story there. They wanted half the people to leave. I've got no idea. You never quite know.
Twitter, for example, that's exactly what they did. They demanded everybody back in the office, got rid of all the people that they wanted to get rid of, and then said, oh, now you can work remotely again.
Who was that? Sorry?
Twitter.
Oh, right. Yeah. Yeah.
It was basically a tool to make people leave.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's quite a lot going on there. So yeah. Philippe's question, he's now rewritten it. Sometimes we have so very intensive periods of work that require to be flexible. People will have to be on spot for many hours, face to face, whereas they're supposed to work remotely. I mean, I guess this is just negotiation, isn't it, really?
And having flexibility in hours. So flexible working is a two-way street. Like,
yeah,
I always talk about it as like double upside. If the employees, like my work set hours are 9 till 5, but also it's a flexible company, then when you do have to work fewer hours, they're going to get the double upside of never having to work longer than 5, but also getting to finish at 3 when things are quiet. Like, they don't get double upside. Flexibility is two ways. Like, in busy periods, we expect, and companies naturally will expect people to pull through, because then in quieter periods you have much more downtime. And it's about being very transparent about why that is. I find when you have to have those difficult conversations around what is expected, maybe when people aren't pulling their weight or not coming into the office, just explain why it matters. And being super transparent on the reasons why you've chosen that pathway can actually make those difficult conversations significantly easier if it's a solid rationale. And I think that's why companies like Grindr with the 2 days, it's very difficult, because they're like, why 2 days a week in the office? And I'm like, I don't know, just chose 2 days because we felt like that was the best kind of decision. Yeah. Naturally, that obviously isn't going to go down particularly well. Whereas if you're trying to justify needing people to come in more often in busy periods, and then obviously much more freedom and working remotely in less busy periods, like that just feels like an adult conversation to explain why people will get flexibility, but also why it might be a bit less flexible when it's busy. I don't know, it feels logical to me.
Yeah, I think it's that adult conversation bit, isn't it? I mean, and it's like, and then that in a way gets to the power of the, or the power imbalance, or the rebalancing of it. In that, I think we are learning how to treat people as adults at work, and
people are learning how to have conversations with their manager when to question and to wonder why things might happen in the way, because for a very long time it was just like, company employs me, I go into work 5 days a week, they pay me some money, that's that. But work and life have started to become much more integrated, much more fluid, and in order for us to be able to make that work, we do have to have a slightly more open and honest two-way conversation with our employers and our employees.
Yeah, and they're not always easy, those conversations, and I think naturally both sides can avoid them to just avoid the dis-ease, the dis-ease, the discomfort of them.
Yeah.
And Yeah, and I guess that goes to sort of what Amy Edmondson talks about, in her work around psychological safety and things like that, is actually feeling that. I mean, I'm actually just thinking back to that story you told at the beginning for being fired for asking for. I mean, I think that's shocking, but it's like that's just how stuck it was, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And I think naturally some people will take the piss when it comes to flexible working, but
Yeah.
plenty of people they're the people that would take the piss in the office as well. I used to sit behind somebody who was believed to be one of the hardest workers in the office because he was there 8 till 8 when no one else was, and he was watching the cricket for 5 hours a day.
Yeah.
Just with the screen protector so that no one could see it apart from me who was directly behind him.
Yeah.
Like people that will take the piss at home will take the piss in the office. It doesn't really matter about that. But those few people that do take the piss shouldn't be the ones that then take away from everybody else having that psychological safety, as you said, Nick, and
Yeah.
being able to be treated by adults and have that kind of two-way conversation. And as a manager, I've worked with my fair share of people who have been have taken the piss out of flexibility, and it's been hard, and those you don't enjoy those kind of conversations, and it probably has made me a little bit more cynical about it, but I'm still running one of the most flexible companies in the world.
Yeah.
You just have to remind yourself of how much benefit those who thrive in a flexible environment are getting.
And so, do you think? So, I'm a big fan of teams meeting together, of very regular informal one-to-ones. Are these? Do you think these are the ways that you build the relationship between the team leader and the team members that actually makes flexibility work? That it is that better that conversations that's going on.
I think they're the building blocks. I think those difficult conversations can be had remotely if you have got that foundation of that kind of in-person connection. And, it doesn't feel like you can kind of understand someone's mannerisms and wording and sense of humor when you've only ever met them remotely, or at least in very rare cases. And so I think it just feels like you've built more human connection, and therefore conflict is kind of easier to resolve once you've met them in person. And I think just the working relationship in general is better. But I don't think everything like that has to be done in person, but it's kind of like a maintenance thing, like it needs to keep happening. And I think like we notice because we don't have an August meetup just because of a holiday, and it just gets a bit hectic. And when everybody comes back in September, like we've got our one coming up soon, like everyone is really looking forward to it, and it will make it feel much more together again as a team as we then kind of go back through it. It feels like a long time since we met. And I think that maintenance of relationships and being intentional about it is super important.
Yeah. Yeah, there is. I mean, just as a reflection of myself, I don't know if you know, but I'm writing a book at the moment. I was writing today about nonverbal cues in relationships, and there are all sorts of things that we do that aren't very easily picked up on Zoom. Hand gestures, body postures. Also, we're doing something very unnatural. We're holding eye contact much more than we would do outside of Zoom and things like that. So there are things which I think in person can only do actually around some of that.
Yeah.
I mean,
Breaking those boundaries, breaking it down is like how awkward it can feel, yeah, when you're chatting on a Zoom call.
yeah, and you get what's called positivity resonance, which is the positivity builds between the two of you, just because it's a natural thing for us to want to do. In fact, that reminds me that back in the questions was a question or a statement from David, I think. So David Tusek is someone I know. He used to be high up in Zoom, and he says that face to face is critical, in person is not. Make sure the right tech to foster great face-to-face. I think he'd be meaning about Zoom, but I did a webinar with him, and he got us to not look at each other face-to-face like this, but to set up our monitor over here, so we were talking actually more like you would talk naturally, and it really did make the conversation change a bit. So I think there's some interesting things that will probably come with tech. I mean, David might be able to say something more in the comments, but it was very, very interesting sort of thing. I'm going down these just because to get questions. So Alicia, my company only does biannual meetups as a remote first business. Maybe that's why staff turnover is quite high. I would think it might be. I mean, once a month is interesting. You pay people to come in for that meeting.
We pay travel and accommodation.
See, I think that's great actually, and I think that's actually. I bet that's where a lot of people's constraints are. There's no budget. I bet the woman who was asking earlier about can't get a team in, probably, Rebecca, you probably don't have budgets, do you? Put in the chat whether you do, but it's actually following up your commitment to it with the budget. In some ways,
what we've seen, because of that, and obviously us going above and beyond to foster that once a month connection, is
Yeah.
then when people do visit London, or they say, as in themselves, they then come into the office voluntarily. They want to come and see people without us paying them to do so. And so it's just the basis of what then creates people's desire to come in more regularly if they're passing through, or if they live the other side of London, if they're coming over, they'll come and work with us for a day.
Yeah.
And it's just about the removing the obstacle of like the office feeling onerous and like a place that you're like, oh, like a child, you know, where you're like, oh, I have to go there, oh, awful. It should be a place that people want to go to because it makes logical sense to go and catch up with your co-workers and have a chat. But it shouldn't be somewhere you're forced into to take Zoom calls from a tiny cubicle all day. That's nonsense.
I don't know if you remember the management thinker Charles Handy. Do you remember him? He was in the 80s, 90s. He was a very big management. He was head of the London Business School. He's written lots of books. Anyway, I remember him writing right back in the 1990s that the future of work was a club. And that basically you'd have sort of members coming in, doing the meeting and going out again. And he was saying that 25, 30 years ago. So I think the brilliant thing with the pandemic is it has accelerated all sorts of these trends which are already happening. And as you said, you know, we can't go back to that before, which is, yeah.
And I think that phrase, you know, the future of work is a club, I think, because there was a small cabal of people that were willing to test and push those boundaries, whereas COVID forced everybody into a mass boundary pushing experiment. And actually the majority of people realized that it was not as uncomfortable as they thought. I think somebody just said about managers, there's Anna there, and saying like a lot of managers kind of pushback is insecurities around like, are people actually working or are they able to manage? But that's a performance management issue. I think we shouldn't be using presenteeism as a proxy for performance. Like that's a terrible measure of whether somebody is working or not. We should be looking at output metrics, and every company, if they were using presenteeism as that easy proxy, needs to recalibrate what performance really means. Every single employee, it should be possible to measure how well they're performing, whether that's direct or indirect contribution to outcomes. But again, it's intentional. It's a big piece of work that every company will have to go through, and every manager will be expected to do for their direct reports. And we do that. We literally have the KPIs that people are measured on, and they can be done remotely or they can be done in person. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, absolutely. So people, we're into the last sort of 5-10 minutes here. So if you've got a question for Molly or myself, that would be great. We've got some things here. I can see Rebecca saying that she doesn't have a budget, but they are contracted to work on site. I mean, that's the thing, is contracts need to be renegotiated, don't they? I mean, that's a difficult thing too. And you may not have the support centrally to do that. So if people have got questions, that would be great. But Molly, I'm thinking, what else would you like to let people know about the whole big subject? I've got one statistical thing. I think shall I share that first and then you go? So we did a survey earlier this year, actually it's January, February, and so it's 6 months out of date now. But I was thinking I'd find this magic thing where 2 days a week in the office was going to be the happiest. So basically, we were asking people in the survey how happy they were, lots of the drivers of it, and then I asked them, you know, pre-COVID, how much do they work in the office? How much are they now? How much they want to work now remotely? So 0 days to 5 days. And there was absolutely no relationship between happiness and the number of days you worked in the office at all. There's none. But there was a relationship. If you aligned the variables and you were working the number of days that you wanted to work in the office or at home, whether that's 5 days remote, 5 days in the office, whichever it was, then you got the happiness buzz from it. So basically, it was about the ability to choose and actually have the right matchup with that actually had the impact on people's happiness, not necessarily the number of days. And I found that quite interesting, actually. Yeah,
I can totally believe that, and I think that makes total sense, because ultimately, if a company is giving an individual choice, there's going to be variance around how many days a week different people come in, and they're doing that because they are choosing the type of work that makes them happiest. Choice has been the kind of like resounding word when we think about the future of work, and I think for a lot of companies, choice sounds scary because it's like, oh, that means no rules and it's just total chaos. Whereas actually the meaning of choice to me in a professional, like working environment sense, is maximum choice within a framework that balances business and cultural needs.
Yeah.
So every company needs to go through this exercise of determining what their minimum commitment to in-person versus remote is. And not just landing on, oh, I'm doing 3 days a week because, you know, that's the most office time we can get away with without everybody leaving. But being intentional, again, that word comes back,
Yeah.
about how much choice you want to afford individuals. And hybrid often gets a really tough time because people are like, oh, hybrid is not flexible. Hybrid offers choice around the days that you are asked to go in. Like, there is still a degree of choice within that. If you're in the office 1 day a week, you have choice on the other 4 days of what you do.
Yeah.
And every single person's ideal working environment is going to depend on how much choice and how much freedom they want and what those priorities are. And so choice doesn't need to be scary. It doesn't need to mean no rules. It needs to mean, it has to mean very clear communication around what is expected. And I think for a very long time, like, companies haven't addressed those elephants in the room. They haven't said, please do come in once a week. Or you need to work between core hours of 10 till 4. That's when we expect you to be online. Otherwise, your performance will be judged. You know, there are loads of these things that we subconsciously do that companies are not communicating to their employees. And then they wonder why everyone's refusing to go into the office or working random hours, is because no one's told them otherwise.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, communication is really, really at the heart of it, isn't it? And I mean, there is a constrained choice there. And one of the things, I mean, thinking back to the woman, I've forgotten your name right now, Rebecca, about you can't get people in. One of the things I think is that we can, it's just purely psychological thing. We can misjudge what the future is going to be when we rate it. So I was saying, when people were saying, asking their employees, how often do you want to come in, without them having been in, is actually not a good way to ask, because we forget, we think about what's going on now. We like working at home. Home feels happy for us, so we think we must be happier at home, and it will almost be a smudge on our home if we wanted to get away from home and go to work. So I think it's been quite hard for people to do it, but actually seeing their colleagues, remembering that they like them, laughing, working on projects together, when when you get that exciting thing, when you really collaborate well, those are exciting ways to work. So so actually asking people when they've had the experience of meeting their colleagues again is a really important thing to do.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And kind of just to sort of add to that one, I feel like there's a lot of flux at the moment as loads of companies go from what was forced fully remote to kind of working out what their individual future of work is.
Yeah.
And I really don't think there's a right or wrong answer. Like, if companies do want to go back into the office 5 days a week and they can still attract talent and keep everybody happy, why not do that? Lean on that being an in-office culture. Like, there's no right or wrong answer. It's going to be a big period of time and exercise of working out what kind of works for you. And I think one thing that's been very interesting collecting, because we've collected, like, gosh, tens of thousands of data points from tens of thousands of companies around exactly like what they offer. And there's very little consistency. Like, hybrid is the most popular, remote is probably the least offered, but one of the most popular, with like supply and demand are mismatched.
Yeah.
But most companies now are moving to offer flexible hours and like loads of different benefits. And hopefully this can also add a bit of value to the people that are listening. Is like, we've compiled that into a big like benchmarking tool. So if you are going through that journey, or you are trying to convince your leaders that what you offer isn't enough and they need to adapt in order to get talent, like, please, it's completely free. And takes 2 minutes. I've just put it in the chat, but like, please do take that so that you can benchmark yourselves against brilliantly flexible companies like Friday Pulse, and like Flexa, and actually see how you rank against the market, because there's, again, so much opacity that exists. Like, no one really knows the direction that other companies are going in, and it feels like we aren't talking enough about it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very, very fitting. So just before we wrap up, be great if people could answer, we just asked this after every webinar that we do, whether how much you liked it, basically, whether you, that question. So Angela, if you could do that, that would be great. We're going to send an ebook. We're going to send an ebook out after this that Flexa and ourselves have worked on together. Please do share with other people as well, if you do. And so, yeah, have you got anything you want to say just to sort of wrap up, really? No,
Just a really, really interesting conversation.
yeah,
And I think, the themes that kept coming up were those ideas of choice and also being very intentional from both sides. And I think that's a big learning journey because there's been very limited choice at work and we haven't had to be particularly intentional at work before. We've kind of
yeah,
all just turned up and done our thing. Whereas in order to get the most out of people, it feels like we're in a real time where we actually could have really create like a paradigm shift and make a much better working environment. But it means people need to get comfortable with the uncomfortable.
yeah. It's a whole. I mean, I think of it as a coming into awareness process, isn't it? It's actually just thinking much more what these relationships are. And I just go back to that word used earlier, which is adult to adult. And actually, we just need to grow up and notice we're not at school anymore. Work is not school. We're not being told what to do by the teacher. We're not being told what to do by our parents. We are adults here. We have a contract. It's an exchange. It has a financial contract, but it's a psychological contract too, and it's a respectful one. And when it's a respectful one, it works best. And if whoever put in there sense of control is crucial to happiness. It is, and that's control from both sides.
Yeah.
So
and managers will need to manage more as well in flexible environments, but then that also opens up a whole other conversation about progression and whether we need more individual contributors that don't want to manage and self-opt out of it because they know they're going to be bad at it, and then we just reward the managers who can manage those people and give them that role. Like, it totally changes the way that we see organizational development and progression and those structures as well. The whole work needs a massive rethink.
I mean, it's just opened a whole other thought, babe, about how relationships are to manage. They're the most difficult thing in the universe, really. I often say to people, I would hazard a guess that everyone's most painful experience has been relational, and managing teams are not easy, and their relationships. So it's never easy, but of course, it's the stuff of life too. So, Molly, I really want to thank you. That was a joy to speak to you. I really enjoyed it. We've enjoyed linking up with Flexa. We are Flexa approved, which we like. We like
flexible.
Yeah. And Friday Pulse is very much about helping people. Actually, that bringing into awareness. Actually, I hadn't meant to do that link, but it's about actually understanding how happy your employees are. Because that's actually going to be how you unlock extra productivity, and flexibility is such at the core of that. It's right there, empowering people, treating them fairly. Yeah. So thank you, everyone. We will follow this up. We'll send an email out with the ebook afterwards. And as I said, please do, if you like the ebook, send it on to other people too. And hope to carry on working with you, Molly.
Thank you very much for having me. Pleasure to chat.
Thanks. I'm a flexer girl in a flexing world. Yes, Maria, that's about right.